one more than anything else. I would certainly start with electronics.
We are live.
Okay. With that, we'll call the meeting to order. Has attendance been taken?
The roll has been taken.
Thank you. Rules and procedures. I would like to remind members of the committee, staff, reviewing public and the electronic participation policy of virtual meetings. Staff and delegates are reminded to keep their video and microphone off until requested by the moderator or members of the committee. All rules for delegations under the city's procedural bylaw continue to apply. Further, in the event of connection service interruption occurs and affects quorum, we may recess the meeting for up to 15 minutes to regain quorum. If quorum is not achieved, the meeting will be adjourned. A full corporate policy 50 regarding electronic virtual participation in meetings is available on review. Excuse me. New rules. I would like to remind the committee of the new rules that have been implemented in the procedural bylaw. Staff presentations are now listed under the presentation section of the agenda. Questions during the presentation portion, where there is an associated staff report, have been removed. Point of order appeal requires a seconder and is not debatable. A ruling on a point of privilege can be appealed without a seconder and is not debatable. Question period has been removed from the agenda. Are there any conflicts of interest on today's agenda? Seeing none. Members of the committee, are there any items for consideration or consent that you wish to separate for discussion purposes? Councilor Carpenter.
5.12 for just an explanation.
5.1.2, okay. Any other separations? Better check, see if I had any. No, okay. With that, we'll call the question on the remaining items.
And just to clarify, item 5.1.1, external auditor annual independence letter, engagement letter, and audit plan is also automatically separated, as we do have a presentation for that today. So the items subject to the vote are as follows. Item 5.1.3, banking services agreement authorization to negotiate. Item 5.1.4, capital budget management and control policy. Item 5.2.1, quarterly status report of contracts awarded. Item 5.2.2, quarterly casino update. And item 5.3.1, the minutes. Items not separated for discussion purposes carry unanimously on a recorded vote. Those voting in favor, Councillor Utley, Councillor Carpenter, and Councillor Martin.
Okay, now we have our presentation. We have just one presentation on today's agenda regarding the external audit, annual independence letter, engagement letter, and audit plan. I would now ask Jennifer Chowan to please come forward and introduce yourself and begin your presentation. You have 10 minutes to present.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Chowan. I'm here on behalf of Julie Bates and on behalf of Millards. We're the auditors of the city. So this evening or this afternoon, the purpose is to briefly review the documents that were provided, the independence letter, the engagement letter, and the audit planning letter. And it's also to give you an opportunity to respond to any questions or comments you might have in relation to our audit planning. As it's our understanding that the mandate of the Finance Committee also includes acting as the city's audit committee. So the first item in your package is the independence letter. As the city's auditor, we're required to be independent within the meaning of the Code of Professional Conduct of Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. And we provide this letter to you annually for your information to confirm that we've complied with requirements regarding independence in the Code of Professional Conduct of CPA Ontario. The next item is the engagement letter. This is page 11 in your package. I think it may also be screen shared. This letter describes the terms of the audit engagement. The entire letter, which has been signed by the city treasurer, is included for your information. However, I'll highlight several key areas of the letter, which include first, the objective and scope of the audit. The objectives of our audit are to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, and to issue an auditor's report that includes our opinion. It's important to note that reasonable assurance is a high level of assurance, but is not a guarantee that an audit conducted in accordance with Canadian auditing standards will always detect a material misstatement when it exists. Misstatements in the financial statement can arise from fraud or error and are considered material if they could reasonably be expected to influence the economic decisions of users taken on the basis of these financial statements. Another area from the engagement letter that I'll highlight is the responsibilities of the auditor. We conduct our audit in accordance with Canadian auditing standards. We exercise professional judgment and maintain professional skepticism throughout the audit. Our responsibilities include identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement of the financial statements, designing and performing audit procedures responsive to those risks, and obtaining audit evidence that's sufficient and appropriate to provide a basis for our opinion. Our responsibilities also include obtaining an understanding of the city's internal controls relevant to the audit in order to design our audit procedures. At the end of the audit, we will communicate any significant deficiencies in internal control relevant to the audit that we identified during it. Our responsibilities also include evaluating the appropriateness of accounting policies used and the reasonableness of accounting estimates and related disclosures made by management, and also evaluating the overall presentation, structure, and content of the financial statements, including disclosures, and whether the consolidated financial statements represent the underlying transactions in a manner that achieves fair presentation. Another item to highlight from the engagement letter is the responsibilities of management and those charged with governance. We conduct our audit on the basis that management and those charged with governance, and in this we include the Finance Committee, acknowledge and understand that they have responsibility for the preparation and fair presentation of the financial statements in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards, for the design and implementation of internal controls as management determines is necessary to enable the present preparation of financial statements that are free from material misstatement, to provide us with timely access to information and unrestricted access to persons within the corporation of the City of Brantford from whom we determine it necessary to obtain audit evidence, and to provide us with information about all known or suspected fraud, any allegations of fraud or suspected fraud, and any known or probable instances of noncompliance with legislative or regulatory requirements. At the end of this letter, it also provides the form and content of our expected audit opinion. And finally, in your package on page 19 is the audit planning letter. The purpose of this letter is to ensure that there's effective two-way communication between us in our role as auditors and the Finance Committee, which has the role of overseeing the financial reporting process. This letter again describes our responsibilities as auditors and responsibilities of members of the Finance Committee. In particular, that the Finance Committee's role, given that you also serve as the Audit Committee of the municipality, is to act in an objective, independent capacity as a liaison between the auditors, management, and council, and to ensure the auditors have facility to consider and discuss governance and audit issues with parties not directly responsible for operations. The Finance Committee's responsibilities also include being available to assist and provide direction in the audit planning process when and where appropriate, making known to us as auditors any issues of disclosure, corporate governance, fraud, or illegal acts or noncompliance with laws or regulatory requirements that are known to you, where such matters may impact the consolidated financial statements or our auditor's report. In planning our audit, we identify and assess risks of material misstatement in the consolidated financial statements, and our audit plan has been designed to focus on the identified areas of risk. We've determined a preliminary overall materiality amount to plan and perform the audit, and we also use it to evaluate the effects of identified and uncorrected misstatements, if any are identified, on the financial statements. Our materiality, as in past years, is based on a percentage of the city's consolidated gross revenues. This year, the preliminary overall materiality is $2.4 million. If we identify any misstatements in our audit, we will request that management correct them. If not corrected by management, we will communicate them to you. We've noted the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the city's operations. However, we aren't aware of any significant changes in accounting and control systems in the current year. We've also met with the city finance staff to discuss the audit planning, and we've also agreed to a schedule for the timing of the work, including audit work at the component local boards, along with communicating identified higher risk areas to city finance staff. And also at the conclusion of our audit, we will meet with you again as the Finance Committee to review the consolidated financial statements and present our audit findings. So in summary, we recognize your significant role in the oversight of the audit, and we welcome any observations on our audit plan. And if there are any specific areas that warrant our particular attention during the audit, please let us know. Also, please bring to our attention any significant matters or financial reporting risks of which you are aware. This can be done through this meeting, through staff, or through direct communication between the committee and us as auditors. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much. That was very thorough. Councillor Utley, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you very much for your always welcome report every year. Can you explain, if possible, how the pandemic affected your role at auditing the city?
In terms of our role, so we were looking for certain impacts of the pandemic on the city's operations. We also know that it did cause a bit of a shift in how staff worked and improved certain functions. Certain things were done differently with staff working remotely. So we have adapted our audit testing to respond to those changes that we noted.
And can you share sort of an example of how that remote communication went?
In terms of with staff, or just in terms of?
In terms of how you conducted your job.
Oh, so in the audit work in the prior year, there was more of a focus on remote. This year, we will be also physically present at the city location to do our audit work. But for instance, if we were looking at expense testing, we know that about midway through the year, expenses and invoices, the records also began to be scanned into the financial reporting system. So that's something that we can access in that way to take a look at.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, seeing no further questions, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
And with that, can I get a mover and a seconder to put the separated items on the floor? Councillor Utley, Councillor Vanderstelt. Thank you. Okay, so the first item is
sorry, just through the chair. I just wanted to confirm that Councillor Utley and Councillor Carpenter did intend to move and second the items not separated at the beginning of the meeting. I just wanted to confirm that as you were the only two in the room, that was the case.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, for me.
Okay, so 5.1.1. Any questions on the audit information? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Item 5.1.1 has carried unanimously on a recorded vote. Those voting in favor, Mayor Davis, Councillor Utley, Councillor Carpenter, Councillor Vanderstelt, and Councillor Martin.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to 5.1.2. Councillor Carpenter, you asked for this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just the staff, the amendment seeks to allow development charges to have a negative balance. Could you explain how that would work?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. Currently, we undertake a number of growth-related projects where the portion that's eligible for DC funding, perhaps we haven't collected as much as we need to fund that. And, our historical practice and within the confines of the policy currently is we haven't been allowed to have individual development charge reserves for specific services to become negative. So what our historical practice has been to sort of gap that shortfall is to go to some of our other general reserves to be able to fund that. And that's really not best practice, and it's difficult to track. So what this policy will do, and what the Act allows us to do, is have individual development charge reserve funds to be able to go into a negative balance. So as an example, so last month, Council approved the paramedic services budget, and that included a growth-related capital component for a new staffed ambulance. Let's just assume the city's cost for that would be $200,000. Currently, we actually only have $55,000 in the ambulance DC reserve. So instead of us going to our tax supported reserves to fund that gap for the midterm, we can go to any of the other development charge reserve funds to fund that gap instead. And then that frees up our dollars to fund our state of good repair and our other program. So when we look at development charges as a whole, we carry development charges for 15 different services. And when we look at them as a whole, this will allow us that some can be negative, some can be positive. They'll borrow from each other if needed to support these growth works and ensure the developer is paying for those projects. But never can we have the entire pool be in a negative at once. Just the individual services can borrow from each other when perhaps funds for one service aren't needed for another service.
And does that account then get balanced back up with more future development charges?
Yes, absolutely. And the ones that are in the deficit would be charged the interest. So the ones that helped fund those deficits are provided with the interest they would have otherwise received.
Okay, but we've changed the ruling on interest too, have we not, for development charges accounts?
Interest that they receive on their balances, or interest
on their balance?
Right. So development charges, if I understand the question correctly, development charges fall under our obligatory reserve fund portfolio, along with some other statutory reserve funds, such as provincial gas tax, federal gas tax, and some other grant funding. And those have and will continue to be interest bearing. It's our general, more non-discretionary reserves that Council a couple of years ago made a decision that they would no longer incur interest, and that budget for that interest remains to offset general operations.
In the general reserve. Okay, and one more question, Mr. Chairman. So the amendment allows council resolution as acceptable measures. Could you give me a brief explanation of an example?
Yeah, so that's really just a housekeeping item. What the policy said before is that the only mechanisms to authorize a contribution or a transfer to or from a reserve or a reserve fund was either 1, through the estimates process, or 2, through a report from staff to council. But in reality, council approves authorization through reserves in other ways, basically through their own council resolutions. So if we wanted to get money out of a reserve to fund an initiative that's brought forward by council, and perhaps not through a staff report or the estimates process, we just wanted to close the loop on that and define that as also eligible action that would allow that to happen.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Daniels. You're muted, Greg.
Thank you. Sorry about that. The branch library in the southwest, we were told that there isn't enough currently in development charges to cover the portion that's eligible for development charges. And it was talked about borrowing from other development charge accounts. Does allowing that to go negative simplify the tracking of all that so that you're not worried about where the money was borrowed from and where it has to go back to? Is that the whole point of this? No, you're on mute, Joanne. I'm contagious.
Sorry about that. It's a common problem this evening. Yes, that is correct. And it does make it easier for us to track. And what it does allow us to do is make sure that those developer contributions as a total pool are being used to fund those growth related projects or portions of those projects that are growth related right off the initial funding hop, as opposed to us needing to require us to look into some of our other, user rate or tax supported reserves to fund that gap. It is allowable under the Act, and it definitely does make it easier. Yes.
Could this be expanded to general reserves so that we can more easily borrow from ourselves instead of going to debentures for some items?
We have actually considered that in the past. So when we are considering debt, we do look at perhaps other reserves that have balances that maybe aren't needed right now. Most of our general reserves are capital specific reserves that receive an annual capital envelope. They don't typically have really large balances, and they're specific for roads, for parks, for facilities, and police and fire. And but it is certainly something that we do look at, and I think the policy actually does allow that to happen. But we definitely bring that to this committee to be able to do that as well.
But as a pool, those reserves would have a significant amount, and it's not all going to be drawn out at once. I'm just wondering if this, negative reserve would allow simpler utilization of that instead of a formal debenture from another fund.
Yeah, I've actually got the section of the policy that's here right now. So it's 3.8. So it does allow for temporary interfund borrowing to cover a reserve shortfall, and it is permitted and encouraged to avoid external debt charges, and that we just would bring that to you for approval so that you're aware.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no further questions, we'll call the vote.
Item 5.1.2 carries unanimously on a recorded vote. Those voting in favor: Councillor Utley, Councillor Carpenter, Councillor Vanderstelt, Councillor Martin, and Mayor Davis.
Okay, we have no resolutions on the agenda. There are no notices of motions. So we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Good meeting.
Well done, Mr. Chair. Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.